pick up a U.S. history textbook. You'll see a lot of oppression in U.S. history. They'll talk about blacks, Native Americans, women, whoever. And they'll have a lot about them, their studies, the history of their, I guess you could say, struggle in this country. But there's often one group that gets left out. And as this slide would indicate, it is the struggle of Catholics in this country. Pretty much since this country has been founded by Englishmen, there's been problems. Ignore the colonial times, frankly, because English colonies and Catholics were not a good match. Most English colonies had laws that in order to take office in their colonial assembly or legislature or to become the proprietor of anything, you had to take an oath against transubstantiation, which is an important Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist. But there was one Catholic from Maryland, Maryland. Hence, it was founded as a place for Catholics to worship freely, but Protestants, mainly Puritans, came in and repealed its acts of toleration. This man here is Charles Carroll. He was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. Most Catholics during the Revolutionary War had very strong American sympathies. Great Britain was not exactly friendly to Catholics. Most of our enemy countries were Protestant countries. Along with Great Britain, we fought a lot of Hessians from northern Germany. Our allies were France, Spain, some Poles, southern Germans, all mainly Catholic people. After the Revolutionary War, for a period of about 50 years, the Catholic Church mainly supported the Federalist Party, but very tepidly, because the Federalist Party was a party of like puritanical Protestants. They wanted to establish a Protestant church, so it wasn't either side, but they'd rather have that than the like Enlightenment secularism of the Jeffersonian Republicans. But Andrew Jackson came to the presidency and changed the way Catholics view politics in this country. First reason would be is because the main population of Catholics, which was mainly English up to this time, had been overtaken by Irish immigrants. Great Britain had taken over Ireland and a famine had struck it, so many Irishmen were forced to come out here. In the 1840s, this tension between Irish Catholics and native Protestants would reach their nadir at the 1844 Nativist riots in Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, not so much. The Catholic Church wanted to have the Douay-Rheims version of the Bible read at school, which is their English Catholic version, rather than the King James version. This angered many of the Protestants in the city, and it led to many of them burning Catholic churches. And so, to react against that, Irish Catholics grabbed guns and stood outside their churches 7 days straight. Violence erupted. So, in the 1850s, the Know-Nothings, who were called the American Party, but they were a party for Protestants who was very secretive, hence their name, Know-Nothings. And they basically said never to vote for a Catholic, never to have any Catholic ever take office in the United States. But Catholic tensions would gradually decrease as the Civil War would loom. And Pope Pius IX took the throne in 1846, but he issued a letter to the presidents of the Confederacy addressing him as the Honorable President. And many Catholics indeed held very strong Confederate sympathies. And this led to very, very poor treatment of Catholics in the North, even though there were many Catholics in the Union Army. After the Civil War, we get into the 1870s and the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, and we see a mass immigration of Catholics into this country, unfully intended. But the apex of the Catholic Church's support of workers came in the 1893 issue of Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, which said that the industrial mercantilism was not to be permitted by Catholic teaching. This is a time when many Protestants were saying that the Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon, and a war with Spain was looming. Spain is another traditionally very Catholic country. In indeed, it would not be long before Catholic tensions would again spring up. In 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was reborn, and this Ku Klux Klan was not one just to hate blacks. It hated blacks, Jews, Catholics, any immigrant. Anybody that was not a native-born white Protestant was their enemy. They would take absolute dread at the 1928 election where Al Smith was a Catholic who was the Democratic Party's nomination for president. You can see in 1928, here is the electoral map. He won Massachusetts and Rhode Island from immigrants, and the only other place he won was the South, because the Republicans still supported integration, and they'd rather have a Catholic who doesn't than a Republican who did. But even Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, North Carolina, states that were all southern states that sided with the Confederacy, were not going to vote for a Catholic. The first time they'd ever voted Republican was in 1928. Later, we would have Father Coughlin in the 1930s, in the Great Depression. This man is basically the equivalent of combining Rush Limbaugh and Adolf Hitler together. He was a nasty, nasty demagogue. He was probably FDR's most brutal critic. It took the cardinal, who would later become the Pope, to visit the United States to silence him. He was the most popular radio man in the world for 2 years straight, 1936 and 1937. In the 1940s, World War II came along and a lot of the Catholic tensions had decreased. And in the 1950s, anti-communism was the big thing, and the Catholic Church was very anti-communist. So a lot of the tensions were starting to decrease. But they would flare up once again when JFK was going to run for president. He was Catholic, and the most polar religious election in history came in the 1930s, in the 1960 election. Protestants supported JFK, Richard Nixon, the Republican opponent, by a 70 to 30% margin. Catholics supported him by a 90 to 10. And so, in the 1970s, Roe v. Wade was passed down from the Supreme Court, and which said that a woman has a right to an abortion in the first 3 months of her pregnancy. That was a big no to the Catholic Church, and that was the first time the Catholic Church and Protestants, or conservative Protestants, actually had something to unite on. And basically the history of that is the Catholic Church since then has been opposing the social liberalism in this country with even more evangelical Protestants, and that's a big change from the 1960s. So basically, summary of the Catholic Church in 7 minutes.